My daughter planned a fancy dinner for the family, but she made it clear my wife and kids weren't invited. As I turned to leave, she whispered that I'd always been an outsider in her perfect life. By dawn, she was the one calling me, desperate for my help. Let me tell you how everything unfolded. I had known for weeks that my daughter was planning this dinner. The invitations had gone out, carefully embossed cards with swirling script, the sort of detail she always favored. She called me a week before, her voice as smooth as the brandy she'd learned to sip at too young an age, and told me, quite plainly, that my wife and the kids were not to be included. I remember the silence that followed, heavy and awkward. She didn't feel it. She never did. My daughter had mastered the art of leaving words hanging in the air, a quiet challenge to those who dared to question her. I swallowed my hurt and told her I understood. I think, even then, I knew what it meant. The dinner was set in an elegant restaurant downtown, all white linens and quiet candlelight, the kind of place where every detail gleamed with the weight of someone else's money. I arrived just before 7, careful to wear the suit she'd given me years ago, a Christmas gift, still in good shape but rarely worn. My wife had pressed it for me that afternoon, her hands lingering on the lapels as if she could smooth away the tension written in the fabric. I was the first to arrive. The maitre d' guided me to a table near the back, tucked away from the grand windows that overlooked the city. It was a small mercy, I suppose, to be hidden from the parade of strangers who would have seen me sitting alone. My daughter arrived in a swirl of perfume and silk, her hair swept back, a flicker of diamonds at her throat. She kissed my cheek with the barest brush of lips, her eyes already scanning the room for the next important guest. She introduced me to a few of her friends, people I'd never met before, lawyers, architects, a banker who smiled with too many teeth. They spoke of deals and investments, the sort of conversations I had no place in. When the others arrived, laughter followed in their wake. My daughter was all bright smiles and clever barbs, slipping in and out of conversations with the ease of someone who'd been trained to charm. I sat there, a quiet figure at the edge of her world, listening as they spoke over me. At some point in the night, she leaned close, her voice dropping just enough so that no one else could hear. "You've always been an outsider, Dad," she said, her breath warm against my ear. "You don't belong in this life I've built." The words fell like a stone in my chest. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say, really. I knew she meant it. She always had. I excused myself not long after, telling her I was tired, that I had an early morning. She smiled at me, cool and distant, as if my absence would be easier to manage than my presence. I walked out of that restaurant into the warm night air, the sounds of the city wrapping around me in a soft, indifferent murmur. I took the long way home, past shuttered shops and neon signs flickering in the darkness. Each step felt like a small act of reclamation. My own quiet protest against the place she'd tried to confine me to. When I reached my door, I paused for a long moment, breathing in the scent of summer earth and the low hum of crickets. Inside, my wife was waiting, the kids already asleep. She looked up at me, her eyes searching my face, but I shook my head. I didn't tell her what my daughter had said. Some wounds were better left unspoken, at least for tonight. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the stillness of the house, feeling the weight of those words settle in my bones. An outsider. But as the night wore on, I realized there was a strange kind of freedom in that. If I was no longer trying to fit into her perfect life, maybe it was time to start living my own again. And when the dawn finally broke, painting the sky in pale gold, I was already up, tending to the small patch of garden I'd planted years ago. Each blade of grass, each fragile bloom, was a quiet testament to a life that was mine, no invitations required. The sun rose slowly over the garden, thin light catching in the dew that clung to the petals. I moved slowly, careful not to disturb the hush of early morning. My hands were steady as I trimmed back the overgrowth, each snip a small, deliberate motion. There was something comforting in the work, the way the rhythm of it pushed back the thoughts I wasn't ready to face. I thought of the dinner, of my daughter's careful smile, and the way she'd leaned in so close, her voice a blade that cut deeper than I'd expected. She'd always been so skilled at that, finding the soft places in me and pressing there, just enough to let me know I wasn't welcome in her world. It hadn't always been this way. I remembered a time when she was young, when she would follow me out to the garden and chatter about the worms and beetles she found in the dirt. Back then, she seemed content to be part of the world I made for her, a small place where laughter came easily and nothing needed to be perfect. But somewhere along the way, she'd learned to want more. More than I could give, more than I ever wanted for myself. My wife, always the more ambitious one, had taught her how to stand taller, speak sharper, play the game that opened doors and shut others out. And I'd watch from the sidelines, unsure if I was supposed to cheer or mourn the distance that grew between us. By the time she was in high school, she was already slipping out of my reach. College sealed it. She came home less and less, each time more polished, more certain of the life she was building. And I learned to step aside, to let her become the woman she wanted to be, even if it meant I was no longer part of the picture. Last night had been a final confirmation of that. She'd made it clear in a single sentence, her voice smooth and untroubled. I was an outsider. The words echoed in my mind as I worked, a low thrum that matched the pulse in my veins. I let them settle there, not to dwell on the hurt, but to remind myself of a truth I'd ignored for too long. I didn't have to keep knocking on a door that would never open. When the sun was fully up, I went inside. My wife was in the kitchen, the smell of coffee warm and familiar. She looked at me, her brow furrowing as she reached for my hand. "Are you all right?" she asked. I managed a smile, one that didn't reach my eyes. "I'm fine," I said. "Just needed some fresh air." She didn't push. She never did. We'd learned, over the years, that some things didn't need to be said out loud. The kids were still asleep, the house quiet in that soft, golden hour before the world woke up. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around the warm mug, and let myself just be. No expectations, no perfect life to measure up to, just the slow, steady breath of a man who had nothing left to prove. I thought of my daughter's face, the cool certainty in her eyes. I wondered if she'd ever understand how much I tried to give her, even if it was never enough. Or maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the best thing I could do was let her keep her perfect world and find a way to live more fully in mine. The day stretched ahead of me, quiet and unhurried. I went back outside, the dirt cool beneath my fingers as I worked. The garden was mine, each bloom a small defiance against the idea that I had nothing to offer. And in the silence, I found a kind of peace. A small, stubborn seed of it, buried deep but alive. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to find out. The morning air was still cool when the phone rang, its shrill insistence slicing through the calm of the house. My wife was in the kitchen, humming softly as she packed the kids' lunches, her movements a comforting rhythm. I reached for the phone, half expecting some distant cousin or an old friend checking in. But it was her, my daughter's voice, tight and trembling, carrying more desperation than I'd ever heard from her before. "Dad, I need to see you," she said. No pleasantries, no soft edges, just that clipped urgency, like she was holding her breath and waiting for me to answer. I hesitated, feeling the old reflex to protect, to make things right for her. But something in her tone stopped me, a threat of panic I'd never heard before. "Where?" I asked, my voice calm. "There's a cafe near the river," she said. 10 o'clock. She hung up before I could ask anything else. I set the phone down slowly, the quiet click of the receiver louder than it should have been. My wife looked over at me, her brow furrowed. "It's her," I said. "She wants to meet." She didn't say anything, just nodded, her eyes steady on mine. There was an understanding between us, a shared history of letting our daughter keep her distance. But this was different. This was a crack in her carefully constructed world. I left the house just after 9, the streets still soft with the last remnants of morning mist. The cafe was small and unremarkable, the kind of place you could disappear into. She was already there, sitting by the window, her hands wrapped around a paper cup she hadn't touched. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes wide and shadowed. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the polished confidence, the careful control she wore like armor. She looked like a child again, frightened, unsure, clinging to the last scraps of her composure. "Dad," she said as I slid into the seat across from her. "Tell me what's going on," I said quietly. She looked around, as if to make sure no one was listening, then leaned in. her voice a whisper. I've made a mess of things. There's someone else. And if this gets out, her voice cracked, and she looked away, pressing her lips together. It'll ruin everything. My marriage, my job, everything. I watched her carefully, my heart aching in a way I hadn't let it in years. She was unraveling, and I realized she was calling me not because she wanted me, but because she needed me to keep her secrets safe. You want me to help you, I said, my voice measured. She nodded, her eyes pleading. I need you to be my alibi. Just this once. No one else can know. I let her words sink in, the weight of them pressing against my ribs. For years, I'd been the one she turned to only when it was convenient, when she needed a quiet, steady presence to hold her life together. And now, here she was again, asking me to lie for her, to protect her perfect image at any cost. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch out between us, watching the way she fidgeted, her hands twisting in her lap. She'd always been so sure of herself, so certain of the path she'd chosen. But in this moment, she was just my daughter again, scared, vulnerable, and so very human. I'll think about it, I said finally, my voice soft but firm. I need to think. She looked up at me then, her eyes searching mine for some sign of reassurance. But I didn't offer it. Not this time. She opened her mouth to say something else, but I stood before she could find the words. I'll call you, I said, turning toward the door. As I stepped out into the bright morning light, I felt the weight of her desperation settle in my chest. I knew she expected me to give in, to play the role I always had. But this time felt different. This time, I wasn't sure if I could, or if I wanted to. The river glimmered in the distance, the water moving slow and steady, unhurried by the frantic chaos of the world around it. I stood for a long moment, watching the current carry everything away. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself wonder what it might feel like to stop being the keeper of someone else's secrets and start living a life that was finally my own. The next day was filled with a silence that felt almost sacred, as if the house itself understood that I needed room to breathe. My wife moved through the rooms with a quiet grace, glancing at me from time to time but saying nothing. The kids had gone to school, their laughter lingering in the halls long after they'd left, a reminder of the simpler joys that still filled my life. I spent the morning tending the garden again, my hands deep in the earth, grounding myself in the small, patient work of nurturing something that asked nothing of me but care. Each cut of the shears, each clump of soil turned over, was a gentle reminder that some things in life could still be trusted to grow, even when everything else felt uncertain. By afternoon, I knew I had to see her again. She'd asked me to lie for her, to protect the fragile tower of illusions she'd built around herself. And as much as part of me wanted to keep that role, to be her shield, her steady place, I knew it was time to ask her the questions she'd never let herself answer. We met in a park near her office, a place she said she sometimes went when she needed to think. She was already there when I arrived, sitting on a weathered bench beneath a canopy of soft green leaves. She looked smaller somehow, her shoulders hunched, her eyes shadowed and tired. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for meeting me." I nodded, lowering myself to the bench beside her. The wind stirred the leaves overhead, sending tiny specks of sunlight dancing across the ground. "Tell me everything," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried all the weight of the years I'd spent waiting for her to trust me enough to be honest. She hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. "It started a year ago," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to happen. He was just there, someone who listened when I felt like no one else did." I closed my eyes, breathing through the sting of her words. She was married, and I knew her husband. A good man, steady and kind in ways that reminded me of myself at that age. "And now?" I asked. She drew in a shaky breath. "He's threatening to tell. If it comes out, everything I've worked for, my career, my marriage, will be over." Her eyes met mine, desperate and pleading. "I need you to say I was with you that night. Just for that one night. It's the only way to keep it from unraveling." I let the silence settle between us. For years, I'd been the man who would have done anything for her. I'd driven hours to fix a leaky faucet in her first apartment, sat through endless dinners with people who looked through me as if I were invisible. I'd never asked for anything in return. But sitting there beside her, I realized how much of myself I'd given away in the process. how much I'd let her take, without ever asking if I was willing to give it. "You're asking me to lie for you," I said, my voice low and even. "To help you keep living a life you don't even believe in anymore." She flinched, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't find the right words. "I don't know how to fix it," she whispered. "I don't know how to make it right." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman she'd become. A woman who had spent so long trying to be perfect that she'd forgotten how to be real. "Maybe it's not about fixing it," I said gently. "Maybe it's about finally telling the truth." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who would run to me with scraped knees and stories of dragons in the garden. I wanted to reach for her, to hold her and tell her everything would be all right. But I couldn't, because I knew that would be another lie. "I can't be your alibi," I said softly. "I won't lie for you. Not this time." She looked away, her shoulders shaking as she tried to swallow her tears. "You're supposed to be on my side," she said, her voice breaking. "I am," I said. "But being on your side doesn't mean helping you keep hurting yourself." She didn't say anything after that. We sat there in the quiet, the breeze rustling through the leaves like a benediction. When she finally stood, her face was set in that familiar mask of control. "I have to go," she said. I nodded. "Take care of yourself." She walked away, her figure small against the bright green of the park. I watched her until she was gone, then leaned back against the bench, letting the warmth of the sun soak into my skin. For the first time in years, I felt something loosen in my chest. I didn't know what would happen next. Whether she would find a way to hold her life together, or if it would all come crashing down around her. But I knew I wouldn't be the one to prop it up anymore. And in that quiet decision, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known I was missing. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet inevitability. My daughter didn't call again, and I didn't expect her to. The space between us, so carefully papered over for years, was finally laid bare. It felt both raw and strangely liberating. A long overdue reckoning that neither of us had wanted but both of us needed. At home, life settled back into its gentle rhythms. My wife and I moved around each other with the soft familiarity that comes from decades of shared silences and small kindnesses. She asked me once if I'd spoken to our daughter, and when I told her I had, she only nodded, her eyes sad but unsurprised. In the garden, the early summer blooms began to open, bright bursts of color against the deep green. I spent hours there each day, the work grounding me in a way nothing else could. The soil was cool and forgiving beneath my hands, the plants patient and unhurried. There was no performance here, no expectations I had to meet, just the simple, steady work of tending to life. I thought often of my daughter, of the girl she used to be and the woman she'd become. I remembered the nights I'd stayed up late helping her with school projects, the quiet pride I'd felt when she graduated, the way she'd always seemed to stand a little taller when she knew I was watching. And I thought of how easily she'd learned to wield her charm like a weapon, how she'd build a life that was all surface and no depth, a life that demanded perfection at any cost. I knew, deep down, that my refusal to lie for her was the first real boundary I'd ever drawn. It wasn't anger or punishment that drove me. It was something quieter and more profound. The belief that we both deserved more than the hollow comfort of pretending. One evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, I took a long walk down by the river. The water moved with a slow, deliberate grace, the surface catching the last of the light and turning it to gold. I found a bench near the edge, the wood worn smooth by years of use, and sat there until the sky deepened into night. As the darkness settled in, I felt a quiet resolve take root in my chest. I didn't know if my daughter would ever forgive me for refusing to be her alibi, or if she would even try to. But I understood, perhaps for the first time, that her choices were hers alone. And mine were to live with honesty and dignity, to refuse to be the silent witness to someone else's deception. When I got home that night, my wife was waiting for me on the porch. She didn't ask where I'd been, just took my hand in hers and squeezed it gently. We sat together in the dark, the soft sounds of the night folding around us like a blanket. For years, I'd been content to play the outsider, to let her world spin on its perfect axis while I hovered at the edges. But I wasn't that man anymore. I was no longer willing to be the quiet, accommodating figure in someone else's story. and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe. The days turned warmer as June settled fully over the town. There was a soft kind of quiet in the air, children's laughter drifting from backyards, the low murmur of sprinklers in the evening, the hush of the river at dawn. I moved through these days slowly, each step deliberate and steady, as if I were learning how to inhabit my own life all over again. I didn't hear from my daughter in those final weeks. She didn't call, didn't send a text or an email. It was as if my refusal had severed something between us that couldn't be mended with polite words or empty apologies. I thought about her often, wondering if she was watching her carefully tended world begin to crack at the edges, or if she'd found some way to patch it back together without me. I didn't wish her harm, far from it. She was still my daughter, and I would always love her in the quiet, unspoken way that fathers do. But love, I'd learned, wasn't the same thing as surrender. And I was done surrendering parts of myself to a life that had no room for who I really was. At home, the garden flourished under my care. Each morning, I rose early to tend to it, my hands finding their rhythm in the dirt and green. My wife joined me sometimes, her laughter bright in the cool dawn air. We didn't talk much about what had happened. It wasn't necessary. There was a gentle understanding between us, a shared relief in the way the truth had finally been spoken out loud. I spent more time with the kids, too. Long walks along the river, ice cream dripping down their hands in the summer heat, stories shared at the kitchen table in the warm glow of the evening. These small, honest joys felt like a balm, a reminder of the parts of my life that still felt whole and good. One night, just as the first fireflies began to flicker in the yard, my wife took my hand and said, "I'm proud of you." The words caught me by surprise, their simple weight settling deep in my chest. "For what?" I asked. "For standing up," she said. "For finally choosing yourself." I didn't know how to answer, so I just held her hand a little tighter, letting the quiet of the night fill in the spaces between us. The next morning, I woke to find a missed call from my daughter, just one, and no message left behind. I stared at the blinking icon on my phone for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then I put the phone down and walked outside into the cool light of dawn. I didn't need to call her back. Maybe one day she'd understand why I'd said no. Maybe she wouldn't. Either way, it was her journey to make now. As I knelt in the garden, the earth cool and alive beneath my hands, I realized that this was what it meant to let go. Not to stop caring, but to stop carrying what was never truly mine. The river still flowed, steady and sure, and the garden bloomed beneath the morning sun. And in that quiet, deliberate peace, I found a kind of freedom I'd been searching for all along, proof that the best revenge isn't in the ruin of another, but in the reclamation of your own life. I was done being the outsider. And in the calm, sunlit silence of the garden, I knew that was enough. If this story of quiet strength and the courage to reclaim your own life resonated with you, let me know by leaving a comment or sharing your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of quiet resilience and gentle redemption. Your support helps me keep crafting these narratives that remind us all, the greatest revenge is living your own life, fully and fearlessly. See you soon in the next story.